"Don't fall for me," Maggie Rowan whispered, her voice barely holding together as Luke Avery stepped close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating off his chest. She had watched men walk away from her before. She had watched her husband die for her. And she had promised herself on the cold morning they buried Nathan Rowan that she would never again be the reason a good man destroyed himself. Luke did not step back. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday. Maggie Rowan knew it was trouble before she even unfolded it, because Clive Danner had delivered it himself rather than sending one of his deputies, and Clive Danner never did anything himself unless he wanted to watch your face fall apart when you read it. She stood at her front door in her worn brown dress, the morning already pressing heat against the back of her neck, and she looked at the document in her hands with the careful, practiced calm that 18 months of widowhood had taught her. She did not read it on the porch where Danner could see her reaction. She stepped back inside, closed the door, set the paper on the kitchen table, and put the kettle on before she allowed herself to sit down. Then she read every word. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Clara Finch, her neighbor, 3 properties east, a woman of 62, who had worked that land with her husband for 30 years and continued working it alone after he passed. The notice declared Clara Finch delinquent on a county land use fee that Maggie had never heard of, originating from a judgment signed by County Judge Harold Briggs. Judge Harold Briggs had died of a stroke 3 years ago in the spring. Maggie read the signature twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly tracing the letters with her finger, the way Nathan had taught her to compare documents when she used to help him organize his case files. The pen pressure was wrong. The loop on the capital B was too open, and the county seal impression beside it sat at a slight tilt that the real seal never made, because Nathan had shown her once how the courthouse press always struck level due to a counterweight the town carpenter had installed in 1879. She poured her tea. She drank it standing up. Then she walked the half-mile to Clara Finch's property to tell her what she had found. Clara was already crying on her porch steps when Maggie arrived. "He said I have 30 days, Clara said. She was holding the duplicate notice, her knuckles white around the paper. 30 days or the county seizes the property for back fees. 30 days, Maggie. I've never owed this county a single unpaid cent in my life." "I know," Maggie said. She sat down beside her on the step, not caring about her dress, and looked at the document in Clara's hands. "I know you haven't, and I think this notice is forged." Clara looked at her sharply. "Forged? The judge who signed it has been dead for 3 years. The silence between them stretched long and heavy. "Then who?" Clara stopped. She looked toward the road, toward the direction of the sheriff's office. Her jaw tightened. "Danner." Maggie said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She walked home with the copy she'd made in her own careful handwriting and added it to a folder she kept inside the false bottom of her flour tin. The only hiding place in the house she was confident Danner's men had never thought to search. She had started the folder 4 months after Nathan's death, when small things began not adding up. A ranch sale that had transferred too quickly. A widow she knew in the next county who had lost her property to fees she swore she'd never owed. A set of cattle she'd seen driven through at dawn carrying brands she didn't recognize. She had not told anyone about the folder. There was no one to tell. Clive Danner ran the sheriff's office. The county recorder was his cousin's brother-in-law. The banker was Warren Pike, who smiled at everyone, and whose name she had seen on 3 separate property transfer records in the past year. Always as the new owner. Always at prices that made no sense for land that size. Maggie was not a lawman. She was a widow who had spent 8 years quietly learning how her husband's office worked. She understood cattle brand registration deed recording procedures, the difference between a county lien and a state foreclosure action, and exactly which signatures were required on which documents for them to carry legal force. She understood, in other words, exactly how difficult it would be to fight this alone. That was the morning she decided she couldn't afford to wait any longer. She needed someone with standing. Someone the town would listen to. Someone who had enough to lose that they would fight rather than simply absorb the threat and move away. She did not immediately think of Luke Avery. In fact, Luke Avery was approximately the last person she wanted to involve, for reasons that went back to Nathan and a boundary dispute, and 3 years of cold silence between Silver Creek Ranch and her front gate. But then the cattle came through her fence. It was the following Thursday, still morning, when she heard the sound hooves, too many of them moving fast and uncertain, the low bellow of frightened animals. She came out of her house to find 7 head of cattle pressing through the gap in her east fence, where a post had rotted soft at the base, and she did what she had always done in a situation like this. She moved. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman, and she had long since stopped pretending that her size was something to apologize for or work around. She moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who has had to be physically capable for her own survival, and she was capable now. Planting herself, spreading her arms, using her voice low and firm rather than high and panicked, to turn the animals to settle the led steer, to walk them slowly back toward the gap, without escalating their fear into a full run. One steer had caught its right foreleg on the broken fence wire. She got it calm before she got it free, running her hand along its flank, the way Nathan had shown her the first year they were married, talking steady nonsense to it while her fingers found the wire and worked it loose. The animal shuddered, steadied, and let her examine the wound. It was clean, not deep, nothing that would lame it permanently if it was treated properly. She was looking at the steer's left flank at its brand when she saw it. The brand had been altered. Clumsily recently, the original mark still visible beneath the new one, if you looked at the angle of the older scarring versus the newer burn. She had seen enough legitimate brands in 8 years to know what a clean brand looked like. This one had been changed after the fact, and not by anyone particularly skilled. She went to each of the other animals in turn, checking their flanks, while they stood in her yard, eating her grass, and looking unbothered by her examination. 3 of the 7 had altered brands. The other 4 had brands she simply didn't recognize at all, which was its own problem, because she knew every registered brand in this county and 2 counties over. She wrote down every brand she observed the original marks and the alterations, while the cattle watched her with their enormous mild eyes. She was still writing when she heard hooves on the road and looked up to find Luke Avery at her gate. How was exactly as she remembered him from a distance, which was the only distance at which she had seen him in 3 years. Tall, broad through the shoulders, the kind of physical authority that came from decades of actual work, rather than the performance of toughness. He wore a light shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a dark brown vest, his hat casting a line of shadow across his face. He had 2 ranch hands with him, who hung back near the road, while he came to the gate alone. "Mrs. Rowan," he said with the careful courtesy of a man who was aware he was on someone else's property and had a history with that property's owner that made social grace necessary. "I'm missing cattle. I believe some of them may have come through your fence." 7 head, Maggie said without moving from where she stood beside the injured steer. "1 with a leg wound that needs treating. All 7 are presently eating my grass and are perfectly calm." A beat of silence. She watched him process the fact that she had already handled a situation he had expected to handle himself. "I appreciate that," he said. "We'll get them out of your yard and repair your fence." "Before you do," Maggie said, "I'd like you to come look at something." He came through the gate. She showed him the brands, the altered ones, the unfamiliar ones, the notes she'd written. She explained what she was seeing clearly, and without embellishment. The way Nathan had always said, the best witnesses gave evidence, facts first, interpretations second, and labeled as such. Luke Avery looked at the brands. He looked at her notes. His expression stayed carefully neutral, in the way of a man who had learned not to let his face ahead of his thoughts. "Altered brands," he said finally. "Yes." "You're certain?" "I am. I can also show you my reference records for the registered brands in this county, and 2 adjacent counties, if you'd like to verify that the unaltered marks on those 4 animals don't appear in any registry." He looked at her then fully, the way he had not quite done when he arrived, the reassessment visible, even though he tried not to show it. "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Rowan?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," she said. "I'm telling you what I observed, and asking if you'd like to see one more piece of information before your men collect your cattle." She brought out the copy she'd made of Clara Finch's foreclosure notice. She showed him the signature, explained the problem with it, told him when Judge Briggs had died. Luke Avery held the paper for a long moment. "Nathan's investigation," he said. "It wasn't quite a question. I was looking into irregular property transfers before he died. Clive Danner cleared the office files the week after the funeral." She kept her voice even. "Nathan used a livestock ledger for his private records. I haven't been able to locate it." Something moved in Luke's expression. Not quite suspicion, not quite discomfort, something in between. "Mrs. Rowan," he said carefully. "Nathan and I, there was a boundary dispute. He accused my family of—" "I know what he accused," Maggie said. "And I'm not asking you to trust Nathan's judgment. I'm asking you to look at a forged signature on a document delivered by the acting sheriff and tell me whether that concerns you." He handed the paper back to her. "I need to think about it," he said. "Of course," she said. "I'll have your fence post repaired before tomorrow morning." He started to say something about the fence, that his men would do it, that she shouldn't, but she had already turned back toward the steer with the injured leg, and after a moment she heard him walk back toward his hands. She finished examining the wound. She stood up. She watched Luke Avery ride away down the road, and she felt the specific loneliness of being a person who has the evidence and not the standing to make anyone listen to it. She did not expect to see him again quickly. She thought she had perhaps 3 weeks, maybe a month, before the weight of what she'd shown him either moved him to action or failed to, and she would know which kind of man she was dealing with. He came back the next morning. She was at the kitchen table with Nathan's documents spread across it. The copies she'd made, the notes, the folder from the flour tin, when she heard the knock. She gathered everything into the folder before she opened the door, not quickly enough to seem frightened, quickly enough that nothing was visible from the doorway. Luke Avery was standing on her porch with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it because she hadn't expected it from him. He looked shaken. "I need to show you something," he said. He had a document in his hand. He held it out to her, and she took it and read it, and she understood within the first 4 lines what it was. A foreclosure notice. Addressed to Luke Avery, owner of Silver Creek Ranch. Delinquent county land use fees. Judgment signed by County Judge Harold Briggs. Harold Briggs dead 3 years. The same signature. The same slightly tilted seal impression. The same impossible judge. Someone had decided to take Silver Creek Ranch. "When did this arrive?" Maggie asked. "Yesterday evening, nailed to my gatepost." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort in it. "I went back inside, and I thought about what you showed me. And then I rode out to look at every one of those 7 cattle individually." He paused. "The brands on 3 of them, the originals before they were altered. Those are Silver Creek cattle." Maggie absorbed this. Someone stole Silver Creek cattle, altered their brands, and let them loose in this direction. That would appear to be the case. To create confusion about ownership. To establish a paper trail that could be used to support additional claims against your property. She folded the notice carefully. "Whoever is behind this knows your ranch would be the prize. Silver Creek is the largest holding between here and the county seat." "I know," he said. "Mr. Avery." She looked at him directly. "I have evidence. I have records Nathan left, and I have observations I've made over the past 18 months. I have been trying to find a way to move against this without getting myself dismissed as a grieving widow who doesn't understand how county business works." She held out the folded notice. "I think you just found the way." He took the notice back from her. He was quiet for a moment. "You said Nathan used a livestock ledger for his private records. Do you know where it might be?" "No," she said. "But I know where it isn't, and I know where Danner hasn't yet thought to look." "Then we should start there," Luke said. It was not an apology, and it was not a declaration. It was a practical decision made by a practical man who had just learned that his own property was at stake. She did not mistake it for anything else, and she was grateful for that clarity. "There's one more thing," she said before he could turn toward the gate. She watched something in him brace the slight tightening of the shoulders that meant he expected more bad news. "Nathan's initials," she said. "Underneath the forged judge's signature on your notice. In the bottom corner, very small." Luke turned back. He unfolded the document and looked where she pointed. N.R. Written in pencil, barely visible in the precise handwriting she had read 10,000 times across 8 years of letters and notes and official reports. Not a signature. Not a legal mark. Something else, a message maybe, or a record. As if Nathan had wanted someone to know eventually that this particular document had passed through his hands. As if he had known that the document would matter later, and he would not be there to explain why. The two of them stood in her doorway, looking at her dead husband's initials on a forged notice threatening to take Luke Avery's ranch, and neither of them spoke for a long time. They began the following week, and they began carefully. Maggie insisted on careful. Luke was the kind of man who moved toward a problem with the intention of dismantling it immediately, and she could see the impulse in the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way his hand went automatically toward the pistol at his hip when he was thinking through a difficulty. She was not opposed to directness. She was opposed to directness that burned the evidence before you'd read it. "If Danner knows we're looking," she said, "he'll move the records. He's already cleared the sheriff's office once. There's nothing stopping him from destroying what's left." "So we move quietly," Luke said with the tone of a man learning to adjust his natural speed. "We move quietly," Maggie agreed. They established a rhythm more quickly than Maggie expected, because it turned out that what she needed and what Luke could provide fit together with the particular efficiency of tools designed for the same task. She needed access to properties, to witnesses, to physical locations that a lone widow couldn't safely approach. He needed comprehension of records of legal documents of the procedural logic that told you which piece of paper mattered and why. She read. He rode. She identified what they needed. He found ways to reach it. On the third day, she showed him Nathan's organizational system, the way her husband had coded his private notes inside legitimate livestock entries, using a substitution method she'd watched him develop over 2 years of working cases, too sensitive to record plainly. It took her several hours to decode the relevant sections, sitting at her kitchen table, with Nathan's handwriting in front of her, and she was aware of Luke watching her work with a quality of attention that was different from patience. He was not waiting for her to finish. He was watching to understand. "You could have done this work yourself," he said when she'd finished translating the first section. "No," she said. "I could have decoded the records. I cannot ride to the Morrison property alone at dusk and examine a holding pen without the men currently watching that pen deciding I'm someone they can remove." She set her pen down. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I'm telling you what I can do and what I can't, and asking you to fill the gap. The same way you'll tell me what you can see in a cattle hold that I don't know how to read." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She went back to her translating. He did not offer to help, which was also correct. She needed to think, not to talk, and after a while he stood and went outside, and she heard him repairing the step on her porch that had been loose since winter. She did not ask him to. He did not announce it. He simply saw something that needed doing and did it, and that was, she decided, a reasonable kind of man. Nathan's records decoded told a methodical story. Clive Danner had been filing false delinquency notices against isolated ranchers people without prominent family connections, without lawyers, without the resources or social standing to challenge a notice from the sheriff's office. When they couldn't pay fees, they had never legitimately owed their properties were condemned and seized. Warren Pike appeared at the county recorder's office within weeks of each seizure, purchasing the land at a fraction of its value. The cattle were a secondary operation, stolen from larger ranches' brands, altered driven through unregistered holding pens to county fairs and cattle depots in the next county where they were sold under the fraudulent marks. It was a way of generating cash while the land scheme built its structure, and it was the piece of the operation Nathan had stumbled into first. He had brought his suspicions to the county recorder. The county recorder had told Danner. After that, the investigation had gone underground into the livestock ledger, into coded entries no one else would be able to read. Nathan had been gathering evidence for 5 months before he died, in what had been ruled a riding accident alone on a back road, his horse found standing quietly while he lay 20 yards away with a broken neck. Maggie sat with this information in the early morning before Luke arrived, and she made herself read it twice. Not because she didn't believe it, but because reading it twice meant she couldn't pretend it was less clear than it was. Her husband had been killed. The man who likely arranged it was currently sitting in Nathan's office wearing Nathan's star. She had suspected this for 18 months. Suspecting it and reading it in Nathan's own careful hand were entirely different experiences. She was pouring her second cup of tea when she realized her hands were not entirely steady, and she set the cup down and gripped the edge of the table and breathed until they were steady again. She was not going to fall apart. She had too much left to do to fall apart. Luke arrived at 7:30, and she told him what she'd found without ornamentation or visible distress, and she watched the steady cold anger settle into his expression like weather moving in. "Danner killed Nathan," he said. "I believe so. Nathan's records suggest he was getting close to documentary proof when he died. Then we need the rest of his records before Danner realizes what we're looking for." "Yes," Maggie said, "and I think I know where they are." The Morrison holding pen was 4 miles east off an unmarked track, and they went at midday rather than dusk, because Maggie had decided that 2 people moving openly in daylight looked less suspicious than 2 people trying to be invisible. Luke had prepared the buckboard with a wide bench seat and a calm team, and Maggie settled herself without comment, or the performative gratitude she'd learned to dread from people who expected her to be surprised by basic practicality. She had brought her notes and her record books. He drove without offering to explain the route, and she did not ask, because they were both adults capable of traveling in the same direction without narrating it. The holding pen had been abandoned for the season, or was meant to look that way. Maggie could see from the gate that it hadn't been truly abandoned. The straw was too recently laid, the water trough too clean, the ground around the posts worn in patterns that meant animals had been moved through it regularly, not occasionally. There were cattle still present. 12 head standing in the back section. Luke walked the pen while Maggie read the marks. She had her reference book, and she worked through the brands, systematically cross-checking against the registry, noting every discrepancy. By the time she'd finished with the 6, she could read clearly. She had identified marks from at least 3 properties that had been seized in the past year, ranches whose cattle were supposedly sold before the properties were condemned. The cattle had been seized along with the land. They were here under altered brands waiting to be moved. Luke had found something else. He came back across the pen with a ledger in his hand. Not Nathan's livestock ledger, but a holding record, the kind that tracked which animals moved through a facility and when. He handed it to her, and she opened it and read the first page, and then the second, and then she turned to the back section where the most recent entries were, and she found what she had suspected and hoped not to find. A signature she recognized. Not Nathan's. Earlier than Nathan's. An approval mark on the first entry in the ledger dated almost 2 years before his death, from a period when the scheme was just beginning. N. Rowan, Sheriff, Cottonwood Crossing. Her husband's real signature. Not forged. Real. Nathan had approved the first fraudulent seizure. The pen, the cattle, the entire structure of the scheme. Nathan had signed off on the beginning of it. Before he understood what it was, maybe. Or after, and for reasons she didn't yet have. Maggie closed the ledger. She was standing very still when she heard the sound of hooves on the track outside, and then Clive Danner's voice, and then the creak of the pen gate opening, and she understood with the clarity that comes from having run out of good options that they had stayed 20 minutes too long. Danner stepped into the pen with 2 deputies behind him. He looked at the ledger in Maggie's hands, at Luke beside her, and he smiled the slow, careful smile of a man arriving exactly where he intended to be. "Margaret Rowan," he said. "You're under arrest for theft of county evidence." He looked at Luke. "You, Avery, your association with this woman just became a matter of public record." Luke did not move toward his pistol. He looked at Maggie. She looked back at him. She kept her face exactly as calm as she could manage, and she gripped Nathan's ledger, his real signature, his terrible choice, the beginning of everything, and waited to see what kind of man Luke Avery was when the situation got genuinely bad. Clive Danner had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes, and standing in that holding pen with 2 deputies at his back, he wore it like a man who had been planning this moment for a long time and was satisfied to finally arrive at it. Maggie did not look at the deputies. She looked at Danner, and she kept her grip on the ledger steady, and she thought very fast. On what authority? She said, her voice carrying the particular tone she had learned from 8 years of watching Nathan manage difficult confrontations. Not loud, not soft. Precisely level. Are you arresting me? Theft of county evidence, Danner said. That ledger is county property from a sealed investigation site. This pen is on private land registered to the Morrison family, who have not been present here in 4 months according to county records. She did not look at Luke. A sealed investigation site requires documentation. Which judge issued the sealing order? Danner's smile stayed in place, but something shifted fractionally behind it. You're not in a courtroom, Mrs. Rowan. No, she agreed. But the same laws apply. She held the ledger out toward him, not handing it over, extending it so he could see the cover. This is a holding record from a private pen on private land. If you're claiming it as county evidence, you'll need to show me the seizure paperwork that makes this location a county asset. Otherwise, you're asking me to hand over a private document based on a verbal claim from a man without jurisdiction outside the town limits. The deputy on Danner's left shifted his weight. The one on the right was watching Luke. Luke was watching Maggie. Danner stepped forward. Mrs. Rowan, I'm going to say this once as a courtesy because your husband served this county. Put the ledger down and come with me without making this uglier than it needs to be. I'll come with you, Maggie said. I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not afraid of a hearing. She tucked the ledger under her arm. But I'm keeping this until you produce legal documentation of your authority to seize it. If I'm wrong, the judge can order me to surrender it at the hearing. If you're wrong, attempting to take it from me by force becomes a different kind of crime entirely. It was a gamble. She knew it was a gamble. Danner knew enough law to know she was correct on the procedural point, and men like Danner, men who had built their power on manipulating procedures, were always more careful when the procedures were named out loud in front of witnesses. He held her gaze for a long 5 seconds. Luke Avery, he said without looking away from Maggie. You want to think hard about whose side you're standing on. I'm standing on private property that doesn't belong to either of us, Luke said. Same as you. Danner stepped back. He gestured to his deputies, and they moved aside, and Maggie walked out of that pen with the ledger under her arm, and Luke 2 steps behind her, and every nerve in her body telling her not to hurry, not to stumble, not to give him a single physical moment he could describe later as flight. She climbed onto the buckboard. Luke took the reins. They drove back toward the road at a pace that said they had nothing to hide and no reason to rush. And it was not until they had rounded the first bend and the pen was fully out of sight that Maggie allowed herself to breathe. That was... Luke started. Don't, she said. Not yet. Drive. He drove. She sat with the ledger in her lap and Nathan's signature burning through the cover into her palms, and she stared at the road ahead and thought about what she was going to do with what she'd just found. Her husband had signed it. His real hand, his real name, the beginning of everything that had stolen 6 families' land and ultimately killed him. She had been so certain, she had told herself for 18 months, that Nathan had been investigating that he had died because he got too close to the truth, that he was a good man destroyed by a corrupt system. And he was. She still believed he was. But the ledger said the story was more complicated than that, and she had not spent 8 years learning how evidence worked to flinch from complicated. When they were far enough that she was certain no one was following, she said, "Stop." Luke stopped the team. She opened the ledger to the first entry and held it out to him. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her with an expression that was carefully emptied of its first reaction, and she recognized that effort because she was making the same one. His real signature, Luke said. Yes. When is this dated? 2 years before he died. The scheme was already running. She took the ledger back. He knew what the holding pen was being used for. He approved its use as a staging area for the first seizure. He could have been deceived about what he was signing. He could have been, Maggie said. He was a thorough man. He didn't sign things he hadn't read. She closed the ledger. I'm not going to make excuses for what this might mean. I'm going to find out what it actually means before I decide anything. Luke was quiet for a moment. How? Nathan kept 2 kinds of records, she said. The livestock ledger I've been working from, that's his private investigation, his evidence against Danner. That ledger started about 6 months before his death. But there were earlier records. He kept them separately. She held up the holding pen ledger. This was filed with the pen's operating documents, which means somewhere in Nathan's system there should be a corresponding entry, his personal record, of why he signed this, if that record still exists. Danner cleaned out the sheriff's office, she said. He didn't clean out everywhere Nathan kept things. Luke looked at her. You didn't tell me about a second set of records. I didn't know if I could trust you with them. She met his eyes without apology. I still barely know you, Mr. Avery. I know you're angry about your ranch, and I know you're useful on the road, and I know you don't talk down to me, which puts you ahead of most men I've dealt with in the past year and a half. That's not the same as trust. He didn't look offended. He looked, if anything, more attentive. What would trust look like? It would look like you listening more than you talk, she said. It would look like you not making decisions about this investigation without telling me first. And it would look like understanding that when we find out the full truth about Nathan, whatever that truth is, you don't get to use it against me. I wouldn't. You don't know that yet, Maggie said. You don't know what the truth is. Neither do I. She picked up the reins herself, which was all the signal she needed to give, and after a beat, he let her take them. Now, I know where Nathan's second records are. But I need 2 days to reach them safely, because Danner is going to be watching me after this afternoon. Luke nodded once. Then we have 2 days. What do you need me to do? She told him. He did it. That was, she reflected as she drove a thing she had not expected. Not the competence she'd assumed that, but the absence of argument. Nathan had been a good man in most ways, but he had also always known better in the way that men who love capable women sometimes cannot stop themselves from gently correcting the capable woman's plan. Luke Avery took her instructions, confirmed the parts he needed to clarify, and then did exactly what she asked. It was so straightforward it felt strange. She would think about that later. There was too much else to think about now. The following 2 days, Luke stayed visible, making his normal rounds, stopping at the feed store, having a public conversation with his foreman, Benjamin Crowell, outside the bank that Maggie knew Danner's men would observe and report on. He was noisy, in other words, in all the right places while Maggie moved quietly. She went to see Ada Reeves first, the wife of James Reeves, whose ranch had been the second property seized under Danner's scheme. Ada was 58, sharp-eyed and bitter, in the contained way of someone who had stored her anger carefully because she'd needed it to last. She had testimony to give. She had been waiting for someone to ask. The notice came on a Monday, Ada said. They were sitting in the back room of the church, which was the only place Maggie could be certain Danner's deputies wouldn't walk in on them. James went to the recorder's office to dispute it. He was told the judgment was final. He went to Danner. She pressed her lips together. Danner told him the county was within its rights, and if he caused trouble, there were additional fees that could be assessed. Additional fees, Maggie said. Made up, Ada said flatly. We both knew it. But James, he was 61. He'd been sick the winter before. He looked at me, and he looked at the notice, and he said he didn't have the fight left in him. Her voice caught slightly, then steadied. We sold the furniture before we left. To have something. Maggie wrote down everything. She had a system Nathan had taught her, not verbatim transcription, which took too long and made witnesses nervous, but a structured summary that captured the essential facts in sequence, with Ada's own words where they mattered most. When she was finished, she asked Ada to sign the page, and Ada signed it without hesitation. Will this help? Ada asked. It already has, Maggie said. I need 5 more statements like this one, and I can take them to the circuit court. Danner's jurisdiction ends at the county line. Ada reached into the pocket of her dress. James kept a copy of the original notice. I don't know if it matters. It mattered enormously. The signature on the Reeves notice matched the signature on Clara Finch's notice, matched the signature on Luke's notice, and all 3 matched the signature on 2 additional notices. Maggie had been quietly collecting in her folder for the past 4 months. The same forged hand. The same dead judge. The same tilted seal. She had what she needed from Ada Reeves. She had 3 more witnesses to reach. By the second evening, she had all 3 statements in her folder and had retrieved Nathan's second set of records from the place she had hidden them 16 months ago. Not in the house where Danner's men had searched 3 times in the weeks after Nathan's death, but in the crawl space under the floorboards of the old feed shed. Nathan had converted into a small office in the first year of their marriage. She had gone there alone the week after the funeral and packed everything she found into an oilskin bag and sealed it, and she had not opened it again because she had not been ready for what it might contain. She was ready now. She sat on the floor of her kitchen with the oilskin bag open in front of her, and she read Nathan's earliest records, and by the time she finished, it was past midnight, and the lamp was burning low, and she understood the whole shape of it for the first time. Nathan had been sick. Not him, her. Maggie had been sick, badly sick in the second year of their marriage, an illness that had taken 4 months and more money than they had. Nathan had borrowed from a man he shouldn't have borrowed from, and the debt had come with a condition, 1 favor at a time of the lender's choosing. Nathan had agreed because he had been desperate because she had been lying in that bed getting smaller every week, and he would have agreed to almost anything. The lender had been Warren Pike. When Pike had come to collect the favor 2 years ago, Nathan had not known yet that he was being asked to legitimize a fraud. He had reviewed a land transfer document, found what appeared to be a clerical error in the fees owed, and initialed the correction. A month later, he had seen the property change hands, and the former owners gone, and he had gone back to look at the document he'd signed, and he had understood. He had gone to Pike and said he would go to the state attorney. Pike had told him that if he did, the debt would be made public, the nature of it, the conditions, the favor. Nathan's career would end, and Maggie's name would follow the scandal. So Nathan had kept quiet. For 3 months he had kept quiet, and then he had not been able to keep quiet any longer, and he had started collecting evidence, and 5 months after that, he had been dead on a back road with a broken neck. Maggie sat on her kitchen floor and read this, and she thought about the man who had married her, the man who had loved her enough to borrow from Warren Pike, who had compromised himself to keep her alive, and then died trying to fix the compromise. She thought about whether she had the right to be angry at him, and decided she did. She thought about whether being angry at him meant she loved him less, and decided it did not. She thought about what it meant that his death was a consequence of choices made in part because of her. She sat with that for a long time. She was still sitting on the floor when she heard the knock at the back door, and she opened it to find Luke standing in the dark with his hat in his hands. "I saw the light," he said. "I was coming back from the Morrison Road. I found the secondary pen, the one I suspected they were using to stage cattle before the depot." He stopped. He looked at her face. "What happened?" "Come in," she said. She told him what she'd found. All of it. Pike, the debt, the sick winter, the favor, the choice Nathan had made, and the choice he'd made afterward. She told it without softening any part of it, because she was too tired and too shaken to manage softening, and because Luke was in this with her now, and he deserved to understand what they were actually dealing with. He listened without interrupting. That was the thing she noticed most. He sat across her kitchen table in the lamplight, and he listened like a man who understood that this was not a moment for his opinion, and when she finished, he didn't offer one. He said, "Are you all right?" "No," she said, "but I will be." He nodded. He set his hat on the table. "The secondary pen. There are 30 head in it carrying brands from 4 different seized ranches. And there's a freight receipt dated 2 weeks ago. Cattle sold at Meridian Depot under a registration number that doesn't exist in the state registry. Pike's name isn't on the receipt, but the receiving agent's signature matches one I've seen on 3 of your forged deed records." Maggie straightened. "Which agent?" he told her. She went to her folder and found the deed records and laid them on the table between them, and they sat side by side, going through the connections, building the chain from the fraudulent deeds to the stolen cattle, to the freight receipts, to the men whose names kept appearing. And by the time they were finished, the pattern was complete enough to present. "We have it," Luke said. "Most of it," Maggie said. "We still need the original deed register from the courthouse, the one Danner replaced the real entries in. If we can get a circuit court judge to compare the official register against the original surveyor records from the state land office, the alterations will be visible. The courthouse is Danner's territory. The state land office is not," she said. If we write to the state land commissioner with the evidence we have now, the witness statements, the freight receipts, the forged signatures, we can request an emergency review before Danner moves against any more properties." Luke was quiet for a moment. He turned one of the freight receipts over in his hands. "He's going to move against us first. He knows we have the holding pen ledger. He knows I was with you." "I know. Then we need to move first," Luke said. "Tomorrow. We need to be certain before we move," Maggie said. "One more piece. Nathan mentioned something in his records, a sworn statement he made privately in case anything happened to him. He doesn't say where he left it, but he says he left it with someone he trusted outside the county system." She thought. "He used to meet with the circuit judge when he passed through, but he also the church. He went to the church the week before he died. He spent 2 hours there." "The minister," Luke said. "Reverend Caldwell was here before Nathan and will be here long after Danner. If Nathan trusted anyone outside the official system, then Reverend Caldwell knows something," Luke said. They looked at each other across the table. "Tomorrow morning," Maggie said. "Tomorrow morning," he agreed. She started gathering the documents to put them back in the folder, and he helped her carefully, precisely stacking the pages in the order she indicated, without asking why that order mattered. She noticed this, the way she had begun to notice small things about him, that he paid attention to how she worked and matched himself to it, without making a point of the accommodation. "Luke," she said. He looked up. "When I told you I didn't know if I could trust you, I still meant that. I need you to know I meant it." "I know you did," he said. "But..." She held his gaze. "What you did these past 2 days, the way you listened in that pen, the way you followed the plan without changing it, that's not a small thing." I was quiet for a beat. "I decided what you knew before I gave you a chance to speak. Out at your fence when I came for the cattle. I heard widow. I saw your size. I saw a farmhouse and a worn dress, and I thought..." He stopped, looked at the table. "I decided, and I was wrong." She had not expected him to say that. She had expected practical acknowledgement, the kind men gave when they were trying to be decent without being fully honest. "Then listen carefully from now on," she said. "I intend to," he said. He left shortly after, and she stood in her doorway watching the darkness where he'd gone, and thinking that she had not felt this particular kind of not alone since Nathan was alive, and that it frightened her considerably more than Clive Danner did. She went back inside. She put the folder in the flour tin. She banked the lamp. She did not sleep well, but she slept. In the morning they went to see Reverend Caldwell, and Reverend Caldwell looked at them across his modest desk for a long moment before he stood and went to the back of his vestry and returned with a sealed envelope that had Nathan Rowan's handwriting on the front. He set it on the desk between them. "He gave this to me 13 months ago," Caldwell said. "He said if anyone ever came asking about the land records or about what happened to him, I should give them this." Maggie stared at her husband's handwriting for a long moment. Then she picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and read the first line of the document inside. It was a sworn statement. Nathan's voice. Nathan's handwriting. Nathan's signature notarized by Caldwell himself. It named Danner. It named Pike. It documented every fraudulent deed, every stolen ranch, every cattle shipment under altered brands. It admitted Nathan's own role, the signing the silence, the 3 months he had not acted. And it explained in the plain, direct language she had always loved in his writing that he had finally decided that what he owed the people he had helped harm was more important than what he owed himself. The final line read, "I am sorry that I was not braver sooner. I am trying now. Nathan Rowan, Sheriff, Cottonwood Crossing, August 4, 1984. Maggie folded the statement carefully. She did not cry, not there, not with Reverend Caldwell watching and the work still in front of her. But she kept her hand on the paper for a moment longer than she needed to. "We have enough," she said. Luke looked at the document in her hands, at her face, at the effort it was costing her to hold herself level. He didn't tell her she was brave. He didn't tell her Nathan would be proud. He said, "Then we take it to the land hearing. When's the next one?" 4 days, she said. "Then we have 4 days, he said. Maggie put Nathan's last letter in her folder, alongside everything else her dead husband had left her, and she stood up, and she began. She did not see what she'd already built. The stack of witness statements, the freight receipts, the forged deed, signatures, the holding pen ledger with its damning first entry, and now Nathan's sworn testament from beyond his own death. She did not see it as an accomplishment because she was still inside the work, still counting what remained to be done. But Reverend Caldwell, watching her walk out of his vestry with her folder under her arm, and Luke Avery half a step behind, later told his wife that he had seen Margaret Rowan that morning, and she had looked like the most dangerous kind of person there is, someone with everything to lose who has already decided exactly what it's worth. That evening she arrived home to find a notice nailed to her front door. Not a foreclosure, something worse. A public summons signed by Danner, ordering her to appear at the sheriff's office to answer questions regarding the theft of county evidence and her alleged role in interfering with an active investigation. It named Luke as a co-conspirator. Beneath the summons, someone had written 4 words in pencil in a hand she didn't recognize. "Stop now or burn." Maggie read it once. She pulled the notice off the door and added it to her folder. She went inside and put the kettle on. Her hands were steady. She was done being afraid of Clive Danner. The summons sat in Maggie's folder alongside everything else, and she slept 4 hours and rose before dawn and went to the land hearing prepared to end it. She did not get that chance. Danner moved first, and he moved the way. Corrupt men always move when they feel the ground shifting under them, loudly, publicly, and with maximum damage to the person threatening them. By 7 in the morning, before Maggie had reached the courthouse steps, the word was already through every corner of Cottonwood Crossing. Clive Danner had stood outside the feed store and told anyone who would listen that Margaret Rowan had been stealing county evidence, that she had seduced Luke Avery into helping her cover up her dead husband's crimes, and that she had been running a scheme to claim abandoned properties for herself using forged documents. He had flipped the entire story. Maggie heard it from Clara Finch, who met her on the road with her face tight and her hands gripping her shawl like she was holding herself together with it. "He's telling people Nathan started the fraud," Clara said. "That you knew and kept quiet. That you brought in Avery to help you destroy the proof." "I know," Maggie said. "Maggie, people are listening. The Hendersons, the Barclays. Mrs. Barclay told me this morning she doesn't think you should be trusted with the case anymore. She said—" Clara stopped. "She said it makes sense now why Danner always warned people about you." Maggie absorbed this the way she had learned to absorb bad news fully, without flinching, and without letting the full weight of it land until she was somewhere private enough to carry it. "Clara, do you believe him?" Clara looked at her steadily. "No." "Then come to the hearing," Maggie said. "Bring Ada Reeves if she'll come. I need people in that room who know the truth." She found Luke outside the courthouse. He had already heard. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his hand was not near his pistol, the careful, conscious effort of a man who understood that this was not a situation where force would help anything. "My bank sent a rider this morning," he said before she could speak. "They're threatening to pull my cattle contract if I remain publicly associated with you. They said my name alongside yours is bad for their confidence in Silver Creek's management." Maggie looked at him. "Then walk away," she said. "I mean that, Luke. If your ranch—" "Stop," he said. Not harshly, firmly. "I'm telling you what happened. I'm not telling you I'm leaving." "Your contract. Sanby renegotiated," he said. "A man's name can't." He held her gaze. "I've been standing next to you for 2 weeks. If I walk away now because Danner made it inconvenient, what does that say about every day I was here?" She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure she could. "We go in," he said. "We present what we have. That's still the plan." "Danner arrested me yesterday and let me go on bond," Maggie said. "He'll try to block my evidence at the hearing. He'll claim it was obtained illegally." "Was it?" "No. Every piece we have was obtained from private property, private records, or from witnesses who gave statements voluntarily." She touched the folder under her arm. "He can claim whatever he wants. The question is whether the hearing officer listens to him or to the documentation." "Then let's find out," Luke said. The hearing room was smaller than a courtroom, lined with wooden benches that were half filled when they entered. Maggie recognized ranching families, some she'd interviewed, some she hadn't, and she recognized 3 men she knew to be Danner's regular informants, and she recognized the expression on the county recorder's face, which was the expression of a man who was hoping to be somewhere else. Danner was already at the front of the room, standing with Warren Pike, who had the composed, well-dressed look of a man who has never personally dirtied his hands and considers this a mark of character. The hearing officer was a man named Gerald Holt, a county administrator who Maggie had met twice and assessed as an honest bureaucrat. Not brave but honest, which meant he would follow the evidence if the evidence was presented clearly enough to make ignoring it more difficult than accepting it. That was what she had built for. She sat down at the respondent's table and placed her folder in front of her, and she was aware of Danner watching her do it, with the focused attention of a man calculating exactly how much trouble she was carrying in that folder. She gave him her most neutral expression in return. Holt opened the proceedings by summarizing Danner's complaint interference with a county investigation, theft of county evidence, and conspiracy to defraud landowners in conjunction with Nathan Rowan's documented corruption. Documented corruption? Maggie said. Holt looked at her. Mrs. Rowan, you'll have time to respond. I'll use it now if the proceeding allows, she said pleasantly. I'd like to know which document Acting Sheriff Danner is using to support the phrase, documented corruption. I'm familiar with the county's records on my husband, and I'm not aware of any documented finding of that kind. If such a document exists, I'd like to examine it before this hearing proceeds, since its authenticity will be central to my response. Holt looked at Danner. Danner said smoothly, "The documentation will be presented in the course of the proceeding." "Certainly," Maggie said. "I look forward to it." It took Holt 40 minutes to work through Danner's initial presentation, and Maggie listened to every word with the particular attention she had learned from Nathan, not listening for what she already knew, but listening for the gaps, for the moments where Danner's version required things to be true that she could prove were not. There were many such moments. Danner claimed that Nathan had originated the fraudulent deed scheme and recruited Clive Danner as an unwitting participant. He claimed that Maggie had known and had begun the ledger-gathering operation to destroy evidence of Nathan's crimes, now that Luke Avery's wealth made it possible for her to take legal action. He presented 2 signed statements from men Maggie recognized as connected to Pike's cattle operation, attesting to Nathan's criminal direction of the fraud. Then he made an error. The error was small. The kind of small that only mattered if you were paying close attention and happened to know the specific fact that made it wrong. Danner stated that one of his witnesses had been present at the Morrison holding pen on the 14th of the month and could attest to seeing Nathan Rowan there in conversation with Pike. Nathan Rowan had been dead for 18 months. The Morrison pen, as Maggie's records showed, had not been in active use until 14 months ago, 4 months after Nathan's death. She wrote the date on a slip of paper and slid it quietly across the table to Luke. He read it. He looked at her. The smallest nod. She waited. She would use it at precisely the right moment and not before. Danner finished his presentation with a flourish that was clearly designed to land emotionally rather than legally. This county trusted Nathan Rowan with its law and its land records, and he abused that trust. His widow has continued the operation in his name. I am simply asking this hearing to recognize what was done and put a stop to it. He sat down. Pike nodded at him with the controlled satisfaction of a man watching a plan execute correctly. Holt looked at Maggie. Mrs. Rowan, you may respond. She stood up. She opened her folder, and she began. She had done this before in smaller ways, helping Nathan organize presentations for county hearings, watching how he built an argument from facts rather than from emotion, how he never raised his voice, because raising your voice told the room that you were afraid your evidence wasn't strong enough to carry itself. She had those lessons in her bones now, and she used them all. She presented the forged signatures first. 6 documents, 6 properties, all carrying the signature of Harold Briggs, dead 3 years. She asked the county recorder by name directly in front of the room to confirm the date of Judge Briggs's death from the official county record. The recorder looked at Danner and then looked at Holt and then confirmed it. She presented Ada Reeves's statement and James Morrison's nephew, who had driven from 2 counties over to be present, and Clara Finch, who stood up when her name was called and said in a clear, unwavering voice that she had never owed the county a delinquency fee in 30 years of land ownership, and did not believe she owed one now. She presented the freight receipts from the Meridian Depot cattle, sold under registration numbers that did not exist in the state registry, processed by an agent whose signature appeared on 3 of the forged deed documents. She laid the receipts and the deed copies side by side on Holt's table and invited him to compare the signatures himself. He compared them. She watched his face change. Then she reached Danner's witness, the man who claimed he had seen Nathan Rowan at the Morrison pen on the 14th of the month. "I'd like to ask a procedural question," she said, addressing Holt. "The Morrison holding pen, as established by the county property record, was not registered as an active livestock facility until 14 months ago. Acting Sheriff Danner's witness states, he saw my husband there on a date 14 months ago. My husband died 18 months ago." She paused. "I'm prepared to provide the death certificate, the coroner's report, and the land registry record for the Morrison pen, if that would help clarify the timeline." The room shifted. Not loudly, the people in those benches knew better than to make noise in a hearing, but Maggie felt it. The particular quality of a room recalibrating the sound of people who had come in believing one story, beginning to understand they had been told a different one. Danner stood up. "Mrs. Rowan is manipulating the dates." "The county recorder has the Morrison registration record," Maggie said, still addressing Holt. "He can confirm the date of registration right now." "Is that accurate?" Holt asked the recorder. The recorder's face had gone carefully blank. "I would need to check the—" "Check it," Holt said. The recorder checked it. He confirmed the date. He did not look at Danner. Warren Pike had stopped nodding. Maggie laid Nathan's sworn statement on Holt's table. She had been saving it for this moment because a sworn statement notarized by a minister of the church carried more weight than almost anything else a private citizen could produce, and she had wanted the room to already understand the shape of the fraud before she showed them the man who had documented it from the inside. "This statement was prepared by my husband, Sheriff Nathan Rowan, 13 months before his death," she said. "It was left in the keeping of Reverend Caldwell of the First Methodist Church to be released, if anyone inquired about the land records or about the circumstances of his death. It names every property taken, every fraudulent deed issued, and every party involved in the scheme." She put her hand flat on the document. "It also admits Nathan's own role in approving the first fraudulent seizure, a role he took because he was in debt to Warren Pike and had no clear way to refuse. He spent the final months of his life trying to repair what he helped begin." The room was very quiet. "Nathan made a terrible choice," Maggie said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to keep it steady, but she kept it steady because this was not a place for her grief. This was a place for the truth. "Loving me did not excuse it, but he spent the last year of his life trying to restore what he helped steal. And I will not allow the men who murdered him to use his mistake as a shield for their own crimes." Danner was on his feet. "She can't produce a notarized statement without—" "Reverend Caldwell is outside this room," Maggie said. "He performed the notarization himself. He can confirm it." Holt looked at the door. He looked at Danner. He said quietly, "Bring Reverend Caldwell in." Danner's face did not change exactly, but something in him went still in the way of a man realizing that the situation has moved beyond the point where volume and confidence will save him. He looked at Pike. Pike was looking at the table. Caldwell came in. He confirmed everything: the date Nathan had come to him, the contents of the conversation, the notarization process. He was 64 years old and had been a minister in Cottonwood Crossing for 27 years, and he spoke with the calm certainty of a man who has no interest in anything except the plain truth. When he finished, Holt asked him directly, "In your assessment, Reverend, was Nathan Rowan acting in good faith when he prepared this statement?" Caldwell looked at Maggie before he answered. His expression was the gentlest thing she had felt all morning. "I was terrified," Caldwell said. "He knew he had done wrong. He knew it was going to come out one way or another. He wanted to make sure that when it did, the truth came with it, all of it, including the part that reflected badly on himself." He folded his hands. "That's not the action of a guilty man trying to escape. That's the action of a man trying to account for himself before God and his community." The room breathed. Danner said, "This is "Sit down, acting sheriff," Holt said. He had the document in his hands now reading. His face was doing something careful and controlled the face of a man absorbing information that requires him to act and who is already calculating how to act correctly. "I'm going to request a short recess and send for the county seal, the real one from the courthouse safe, to compare against the impressions on these deeds." He looked at Maggie. "Do you have a specific claim regarding the seal?" "The impressions on the forged deeds sit approximately 3 degrees off level," she said. "The real courthouse seal press strikes level because of a counterweight installed in 1879. The difference is visible to the naked eye if you have both impressions to compare." She did not say, "Nathan showed me this." She did not say, "I learned this from a man who is dead because he got too close to this same truth." She said it plainly as a fact because it was a fact, and this was a hearing, and facts were what mattered here. Holt called the recess. In the 15 minutes while they waited, Maggie sat at the table and did not speak to anyone and did not look at Danner. She was aware of Luke behind her, of his stillness, of the way he had not once interrupted or attempted to speak on her behalf during the entire presentation. He had simply been present, and being present was the right thing, and he had understood that without being told. She was also aware of the moment about 8 minutes into the recess, when she heard movement near the back of the room and turned to see one of Danner's deputies, a young man not much past 20, who she had seen at the sheriff's office a dozen times, and who had always seemed uncomfortable in his uniform, stand up from his bench and walk toward Holt's aide near the door and say something quietly. The aide went to find Holt. Maggie watched this and said nothing. When the recess ended and the seal comparison confirmed exactly what she had said it would, Holt held both impressions up to the room and invited anyone who wanted to look to come look, and 4 ranchers came forward and looked and came back to their benches with expressions that told their own story. Danner stood up to speak again. He did not get far. The young deputy was already on his feet. His name, Maggie learned in the next 4 minutes, was Thomas Greer, and he had been Danner's most junior hire, brought on 8 months ago because he needed work, and Danner had offered it, and he had spent 8 months doing what he was told and looking the other way at things that troubled him and telling himself it wasn't his place to speak. He had apparently decided it was his place now. Thomas Greer stood in front of Holt and said in a voice that only shook slightly that he had been present on the night of October 9th, 1884, when Clive Danner had instructed 2 men Thomas could name, to follow Nathan Rowan on his evening patrol and ensure that Nathan Rowan did not return from it. He said he had not known when Danner gave the instruction that it was an order to kill. He said he had understood it the morning after, when Nathan was dead, and Danner had explained to his 3 remaining deputies that this was what happened to people who caused problems for the county, and that they would do well to remember it. He said he had been living with this for 8 months, and he could not live with it any longer. The room erupted. It was not loud chaos. These were ranching people who kept their feelings inside because their survival had always depended on it. But the eruption was real, was audible, was the sound of a community discovering that what they had suspected and refused to believe was actually true. Danner made one move toward the door, and Luke was there. He did not touch Danner. He simply stood between Danner and the exit, his full height, his full width, unhurried. "I think," Luke said quietly, "you should stay where you are." Danner looked at him. He looked at the room behind him. He looked at Warren Pike, who had gone a color that was not quite natural and was staring at his own hands on the table. He sat back down. Holt suspended the hearing and sent for restraints and sent a rider to the county seat for a state marshal, because he was a man who understood the limits of his authority and understood that what had just happened in his hearing room required more authority than he had. Maggie sat at the table and watched all of this and felt something she did not immediately recognize because it had been so long since she had felt it, the specific, exhausted, quiet sensation of something being over. She became aware that Luke had come to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her, and that his hand was near hers on the table, without touching it, available, without insisting. "It's done," he said. "Almost," she said. "There's still the state review. The properties need to be formally restored. Nathan's statement needs to be properly entered into the record. The cattle." "Maggie," his voice was very quiet. "It's done enough for today. She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at Nathan's sworn statement, which Holt had taken as evidence, and which she would not get back. Which was right, which was where it needed to be in the official record doing the work Nathan had always meant it to do. She pressed her lips together. She breathed in once carefully. "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat in the emptying room for a moment that neither of them rushed, and Maggie thought about Nathan, about the man who had borrowed from the wrong person to keep her alive, and then died trying to be better than that choice. And she thought about what she owed him and what she owed herself, and whether those two things had to be in conflict forever. She did not have the answer yet, but she was no longer afraid of the question. Outside, the afternoon was pressing down hard and bright, and Cottonwood Crossing continued its ordinary business around the extraordinary thing that had just happened inside a county hearing room, because towns have a way of absorbing enormous events and then going on about their business, and life has a way of continuing whether you are ready for it or not. That night, a summer storm came in fast, the way Texas storms always did, and Maggie went to Nathan's old office. She still had the key, had never been asked for it back, because there were the last few files she had known about for months, and had not been able to bring herself to retrieve until now, files that were no longer evidence for a case, but were simply her dead husband's personal records, and she wanted them before Holt's men came to formally inventory the space. She did not expect Luke to follow her. She had not told him where she was going. But the door opened, and he came in out of the rain, and he stopped when he saw her face, and she did not try to hide what was on it, because she was too tired to manage the performance of being fine. "I keep thinking," she said, "that he died because of me." "No," Luke said. "He borrowed from Pike because I was sick. If I hadn't been—" "He made a choice," Luke said. He was not harsh about it. He was precise. "A choice I understand, one I might have made myself if someone I loved was lying in a bed getting smaller every week. But it was his choice. You didn't make it for him." "He died trying to undo it." "Yes, and he did undo it mostly. That's in the record now." Luke looked at her steadily. "That's going to be the thing that lasts, not the mistake. What he did about the mistake." Maggie pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, against the tight-packed grief that had lived there for 18 months and was now shifting, changing shape, becoming something she might eventually be able to carry, instead of something that carried her. "Don't fall for me, Luke." The words came out quieter than she intended. Nathan did, and it destroyed him. She meant it honestly, not as a performance, not as the self-deprecating deflection she had watched other women use, but as a real warning from someone who had watched love make a good man, make a terrible choice, and then die in consequence of it. Luke did not step back. He also did not step forward without permission. "Nathan made his choices," he said. "I will make mine, but I won't touch you unless you want me to." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had sat beside her in that hearing room for 3 hours without once trying to speak for her. Who had stood between Danner and the door with no weapon and no drama, just his body and his stillness. Who had listened to her tell the story of her dead husband's failure and her own grief, and had not offered her comfort she didn't ask for or advice she didn't need. "I'm afraid," she said. "I know," he said. She stepped toward him. She lifted her face, and she held his gaze, and she gave him the permission he had said he would wait for, because she was Maggie Rowan, and she was capable of making her own choices, and this was hers. He kissed her gently. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was an honest acknowledgement between two people who had been through something real together, that what they felt was also real, and that neither of them was able to pretend otherwise anymore. Then the shot came. Single crack closed from the direction of the alley along the side of the building, and glass somewhere above them shattered with a bright, sudden violence that broke the moment absolutely. Luke moved immediately, not toward the sound, toward Maggie, putting himself between her and the direction the shot had come from. And then they were both moving toward the rear door, with the instinct of people who have learned that staying in an open space when someone is shooting is the fastest way to stop making decisions about anything. They came out into the wet alley through the back door. Behind them, Maggie heard the sound of boots on wood. Danner's men or Pike's, or someone who had decided that the hearing's outcome was not the last word, and that fire or a second shot might accomplish what the first one hadn't. She had the folder. She had Nathan's remaining records. She held them against her body, and she ran. Luke was beside her, not in front of her, and that was the last thing she noticed before the full dark of the storm closed around them and the burning began. They ran 3 blocks through the storm before Luke pulled her into the doorway of the grain merchant's building, and they both stopped breathing hard, listening. No second shot. No boots following on the wet road. Whatever the first shot had been warning poor aim or a man who'd lost his nerve the moment his target moved, it had not been followed. Maggie stood with the folder pressed against her chest, and rain running off the brim of Luke's hat onto the floor between them, and her heart hitting the inside of her ribs, at a pace that had as much to do with the last 2 minutes as with the 2 minutes before them, when she had stepped toward a man and lifted her face, and chosen something she hadn't allowed herself to want in 18 months. "Are you hurt?" Luke said. "No. You? No." He looked back the way they'd come. That shot came from the alley east of the office, hired most likely. Danner's already in custody, and Pike doesn't do his own shooting. "Pike still has men," Maggie said. "The 2 at the Morrison pen, the freight agent at Meridian. They'll scatter now." Luke looked at her. "Holt has the statement. The state marshal is coming. Pike knows the walls are closing." "Scared men do desperate things," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "So we don't go back to your house tonight." She thought about arguing and decided there was no argument worth making. Her house was the first place anyone looking for her would go, and alone she had no way to know who might be waiting. The folder in her hands contained the last of Nathan's original records, the copies she had made over 18 months, her witness notes, her comparison documents. If those burned, the case would survive on the official record, but the private history Nathan had built would be gone. "The church," she said. "Reverend Caldwell already knows everything, and no one with any sense shoots at a minister's door in the middle of a storm." Luke almost smiled at that. Almost. "The church," he agreed. Caldwell opened the door before they finished knocking, which meant he had been awake and watching, which meant he had heard the shot from wherever it had come from and had already understood the shape of the next few hours. "Come in," he said, and that was all he said, which was the right amount. He put them in the vestry with a lamp and a pot of coffee and went back to his own quarters, and Maggie sat down on the wooden bench along the wall and let herself stop moving for the first time since the hearing had ended, and felt the full accumulated weight of the day arrive on her all at once. Luke sat across from her. He poured the coffee. He handed her a cup. She wrapped both hands around it and said nothing for a while. "Nathan's office," she said eventually. "Before the shot. I want you to know that wasn't—" She stopped. "I don't do things I don't mean." "I know," he said. "I'm still afraid," she said. "You told me that already," he said. "I haven't changed my position since." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Your position being—" "That I will wait," he said, "for as long as it takes, and that I will not push, and I will not perform patience, so you'll feel obligated to reward it. I will just—" He paused, searching for the word. "Be here, when it's useful, and not be here when it isn't." It was, she thought, the most useful thing anyone had said to her in a year and a half. Not a promise of devotion, not a declaration of love designed to make her feel she owed him something. A simple statement of intent that asked nothing back. "All right," she said. She drank the coffee. He drank his. Outside, the storm worked through its last energy and began to quiet, and Cottonwood Crossing settled into a wet and exhausted night, around the 2 of them sitting in Reverend Caldwell's vestry, with a lamp between them, and more truth between them than most people managed in a year of knowing each other. The state marshal arrived the following morning. His name was Hector Brand, a compact, deliberate man in his 40s, who had been sent from Austin with authority to take jurisdiction of the entire case, which meant Holt could hand over everything he'd accumulated and stop being responsible for a situation that had grown significantly beyond a county hearing. Maggie met with Brand for 2 hours. She gave him the folder, walked him through every document in the order she'd obtained them, and answered his questions with the same precision she had used at the hearing. Brand asked good questions, the kind that tested the chain of evidence, rather than simply accepting the narrative, and she was glad of it, because the chain held every link, because she had built it to hold. He asked her about Luke. She told him exactly what Luke had contributed and exactly what she had contributed, and made certain he understood the distinction, because she was not going to allow Luke's involvement to overshadow her work, and she was not going to allow her work to be attributed to Luke, because he was the one with the well-known name and the large ranch. Brand wrote it down as she said it. She watched him write it. She was satisfied. Danner was formally charged that afternoon conspiracy to defraud, extortion, and the arrangement of Nathan Rowan's murder, based on Thomas Greer's testimony, and corroborated by a second deputy, who it turned out had been quietly sick about it for months, and needed only to see someone else speak first to find the nerve to do the same. Warren Pike was charged alongside him, and Pike predictably immediately, with the instinct of a man who had always bought his way clear of consequences, offered to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge. Brand took the offer. Pike's cooperation meant the full financial trail, the names of the receiving agents, the bank drafts, the property records. Every piece of the operation that Maggie had traced partially could now be traced completely from the inside. It meant the case was unassailable. It meant the families who had lost their land were going to get it back. Maggie heard this in Brand's office, and she sat with it for a moment, feeling it settle into her like water into dry ground. Clara Finch, Ada Reeves, James Morrison's nephew, the Hendersons, the Barclays, the three other families whose names were in Nathan's ledger. They were going home. That was what this had been for. Not for her own safety, not even for Luke's ranch, but for those families who had trusted that the county worked the way it was supposed to work and had been betrayed by the man who was supposed to uphold it. She thought Nathan would have been glad of that. She thought he would have been glad she was the one who finished it. The week that followed was administrative and exhausting in the specific way of paperwork, court filings, property restoration orders, brand registry corrections, the formal entry of Nathan's sworn statement into the county record. Maggie worked with Brand's aid for 4 days straight, organizing the documentation into the structure the circuit court required, and she did not see Luke during those 4 days, except for one morning when he appeared at the courthouse steps with fresh coffee and a question about a deed number she'd mentioned, and stayed exactly long enough to be useful, and then left. She noticed that. She filed it alongside other things she had been noticing about him. On the 5th day, Brand found her in the courthouse record room, where she'd established a temporary workspace, and he told her that Gerald Holt, the hearing officer, had submitted a formal recommendation to the county commissioners that the record-keeping office be restructured with an independent civilian oversight position, given the extent to which the current system had been abused. "He suggested your name," Brand said. Maggie looked up from the deed transfer she was annotating. "My name." "For the oversight position." Brand had a quality of directness she appreciated. A civilian record examiner, essentially. Someone who knows brand registration deed procedures and county records well enough to catch irregularities before they become crimes. She was quiet for a moment. That would require the county commissioners to approve it. 3 of the 5 already have. Brand set a letter on her desk. The other 2 will be easier once the court formally vacates the fraudulent deeds, which will happen Tuesday. She picked up the letter. She read it. She set it down. "I'll need office space," she said. "Adjacent to the courthouse, not inside it. I want it clearly understood that I answer to the circuit court, not to whoever happens to be running the county at any given time." "That's already in the proposal," Brand said. She looked at him. "You wrote this proposal." "Holt signed it," Brand said. "I suggested the structure." He almost smiled. "You came in with better documentation than half the cases I handle at the state level." "Mrs. Rowan, that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone knows how evidence works and cares enough to build it correctly." He picked up his hat. "The county needs someone who will keep caring about that after I go back to Austin." He left. She sat alone in the record room and thought about it, and what she thought was Nathan had started this work. She had finished this chapter of it. But the work itself, the watching, the checking, the making sure the procedures that protected ordinary people actually worked the way they were supposed to, that work didn't end with Danner's arrest. Someone needed to keep doing it. She pulled the letter toward her and wrote her acceptance in the margin. She told Luke that evening when he came to her gate for the first time in 5 days, hat in hand, standing on the correct side of the property line, in a way she had not told him to do, but that told her something about him anyway. "They're giving me an office," she said. "Next to the courthouse. County record examiner independent of the sheriff's department." He looked at her steadily. "That's exactly the right thing." "It doesn't pay much," she said. "It doesn't need to," he said. "You have your house, you have the property, and in 6 months, you'll have half the county's ranchers paying you to read their contracts before they sign them, because word will get out that you catch what lawyers miss." He said this as plain fact, not compliment. "You know I'm right." She did know he was right. "Come in," she said. He came in, and she made dinner, and they ate at her kitchen table, the same table where she had spent so many nights alone with Nathan's records and her own calculations, and it was ordinary in a way that should have felt strange, and instead felt like something she had forgotten was possible. He told her about Silver Creek. The bank had backed down from its contract threat almost immediately once Brand's investigation became public. No financial institution wanted its name attached to a case that had made state-level news, and the railroad contract had been secured for another 2 years. His foreman, Benjamin Crowell, had apparently been following the hearing through town gossip, and had shown up at the ranch house the evening it ended, to say in his economical way that he hoped Luke had sense enough to recognize a good thing when it was standing right in front of him. "What did you tell him?" Maggie asked. "I told him to mind the cattle," Luke said, "and that I was working on it." She laughed. It surprised her, not the laugh itself, but the ease of it, the way it came up naturally without effort or performance. She hadn't laughed easily in a long time. Luke looked at her when she laughed with an expression she had learned to read in the past 3 weeks' attention. Without demand, the face of a man who found her genuinely interesting and was not embarrassed to show it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for anything recent. For 3 years ago, the boundary dispute." "Nathan handled that badly," she said. "He did, but I made it worse. I took it personally when I should have taken it legally, and I made it about pride when it should have been about the fence line." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He came to me 2 months before he died. Did you know that?" She went still. "No. He knocked on my door at 7 in the morning and he apologized. Formally, like it cost him something, which I could see it did." Luke was quiet for a beat. "He said that some of the things he'd said about my family's claim were not supported by the survey records, and he knew it, and that he was sorry he'd let it go on as long as he had." He looked at her. "I didn't understand why he was doing it at the time. I thought he was trying to clear up loose ends before some kind of legal action. Now I think, I was trying to put things right," Maggie said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "All of it. Every bit he could reach." "Yes." She pressed her lips together. She breathed. "I'm glad he did that. I didn't know. I thought you should." She reached across the table and put her hand over his for one moment. Not romantic, not promising, just human. The gesture of one person telling another that what they said mattered. Then she took her hand back and picked up her coffee. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded. He did not make more of the moment than she had given it, and she was grateful for that too. He came back on Thursday and Sunday. He accompanied her to church without making it a statement, which meant they walked in at the same time and sat near each other without performing the relationship for the watching eyes that were absolutely watching. Some of the watching was kind. Clara Finch caught Maggie's arm on the way out and squeezed it once and said nothing, which said everything. Some of the watching was the other kind. 2 women near the door after the service said something in voices pitched to Carrie without being direct. The word rescue appeared. The phrase desperate circumstances followed it. Maggie heard it. She knew Luke had heard it. She watched herself decide what to do with it, whether to feel ashamed, which was the emotion they were trying to produce, or whether to feel something else. She felt mostly tired of it. Tired of the assumption that a woman of her size and her widowhood and her limited resources must be waiting to be chosen. Tired of the idea that whatever she and Luke were or were not was about what she could get from him, rather than what they had learned about each other in 3 weeks of actual difficulty. She was going to walk past those 2 women and not give them the satisfaction of knowing she had heard. Luke stepped beside her, not in front, beside, and offered his hand with his palm up, which was not the grip of a man leading a woman somewhere, but the open hand of someone making an invitation and leaving the answer entirely up to her. "The choice is yours," he said quietly. She put her hand in his. She walked out of that church with her head level and her steps even, and the specific dignity of a woman who has decided that other people's narratives about her life are not her responsibility to manage. They walked to the boundary line between her property and Silver Creek, as the afternoon went golden and long, and he told her what he'd been thinking, and he said it plainly. The way she had come to understand was simply how he spoke when he was being serious. "I want to court you with marriage in mind," he said. "I want that to be honest and out in the open, not something we manage quietly to avoid comment." He looked at her steadily. "But I want you to understand what I mean by it. Your house stays yours. The record office stays yours. Your income, your name, your work. None of that becomes mine because you marry me. I'm asking you to share your life, not surrender it." Maggie looked at the gate between their properties, the one Luke had repaired 3 weeks ago without being asked while she was inside decoding Nathan's ledger, which felt like a long time ago, and also no time at all. "You already fell for me, didn't you?" she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Hard enough to learn that standing beside a woman is different from standing in front of her. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Nathan, who had loved her enough to make a terrible choice. She thought about what it meant to accept love from someone new, without betraying the love she'd had before. She thought about whether those two things had to be in conflict, and decided for the final time that they did not. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "When the court has finished with the property restorations, and I've had 3 months in the new office, and I know what my life looks like on its own terms." She held his gaze. "Not because I'm uncertain about you, because I want to come to you as myself, not as a woman who accepted the first kind offer because she was still standing in the wreckage." He looked at her as if she had said something that confirmed a conclusion he had already reached. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. He kissed her then at the gate between their properties, with the late afternoon going warm around them, and this time she was the one who drew him closer because it was her choice and she was making it clearly and without apology. Then she went inside and sat at her kitchen table and wrote 2 letters, one to Brand's office confirming her acceptance of the county position, and one to the circuit court, requesting formal documentation of the property restoration orders so she would have them ready for the families who needed them. She worked until the lamp burned low. She was not Sheriff Rowan's widow sitting in the dark with her dead husband's records. She was Maggie Rowan County Record Examiner, sitting in her own house at her own table, doing her own work. The difference felt enormous. It felt finally like ground she was standing on, rather than ground that was swallowing her. In the morning she would go to the courthouse. She would set up her office. She would begin. But the morning that arrived brought something she had not planned for. A letter slipped under her door, sometime before dawn. In handwriting she didn't recognize on paper that had the faint smell of the Meridian Depot. Warren Pike's freight agent, the one whose signature had appeared on the forged documents, the one who had presumably scattered when Pike began cooperating with Brand. She opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee still in her robe and read it twice. He had not scattered. He was still in the county, and he was offering testimony, additional testimony beyond what Pike had given about a third party involved in the scheme, whose name had not yet appeared in any record. A third party he wrote with access to the circuit court calendar, who had known in advance every time a traveling judge was due to arrive in Cottonwood Crossing, who had used that knowledge to time the fraudulent deed filings to avoid judicial review. A third party who was not Danner, not Pike, someone who had been in the letter's careful phrase above both of them. Maggie set the letter down. She picked it up. She read it one more time. She had believed they had all believed that arresting Danner and Pike had closed the circle, that Thomas Greer's testimony and Nathan's sworn statement and the forged seals had accounted for everyone involved. She picked up her pen. She wrote a short note to Luke telling him to come to the courthouse at 9 and not to stop at the sheriff's office on the way. She wrote a second note to Brand's hotel and asked the boy next door to carry them both before breakfast. Then she got dressed, and she gathered her folder, a new one, a fresh one, started at the top of a clean page, and she went to find out how deep this actually went. Because the work she was discovering had a way of not being finished just because you believed it was. Because the truth had layers that didn't always reveal themselves all at once. And because she was Maggie Rowan, and this was what she did. She was ready. The boy delivered both notes before 8 o'clock, which meant Luke arrived at the courthouse at 8:30, a full 30 minutes earlier than she'd asked, which told her something about how seriously he was taking the single line she had written, "Come at 9. Do not stop at the sheriff's office." He found her already at her new desk, a borrowed table pushed against the wall of the small room adjacent to the courthouse records vault. The room that would officially become the county record examiner's office once the commissioners signed the final paperwork, which they would do Thursday. The letter from Pike's freight agent was in the center of the table. She had written 3 pages of notes around it. Luke read the letter. He read her notes. He set them both down. "A third party," he said. "Someone with access to the circuit court calendar," Maggie said. "Someone who knew when judges were coming through, which meant they could time every fraudulent filing to land between judicial visits. No traveling judge ever saw those deeds until after the properties had already transferred." "That's not county-level access," Luke said. "The circuit court calendar is managed from the district office." "Yes," Maggie said. He looked at her. "You already know who it is." "I have a strong suspicion," she said carefully. "I want Brand before I say it out loud. Because if I'm right, saying it without a marshal in the room is the kind of mistake that ends this before it finishes." She had sent the second note to Brand's hotel. His aide appeared at the courthouse door 20 minutes later with Brand himself. Coat still being buttoned. Coffee apparently abandoned, which was how she knew he had read the letter from the freight agent, whose name it turned out was a man called Gerald Sutton, and understood immediately that the case was not as closed as they had believed. Brand sat down. He read Sutton's letter. He read Maggie's notes. Then he said, "District Clerk Arthur Vane." Maggie looked at him. "You knew." "I suspected," Brand said. "For about 6 months. Vane's travel records showed him in Cottonwood Crossing twice in the weeks before 2 of the largest property seizures. I couldn't find a clean connection to Pike. There was a layer between them that I hadn't untangled." He tapped the letter. "Sutton is the layer." "Sutton received the court calendar from Vane," Maggie said. "He passed the timing windows to Pike, who passed them to Danner. Vane received a percentage of each property transfer." She had worked this out in her notes, and she laid them in order in front of Brand. Now clean and sequenced the way she had learned to build everything. Facts first, connections, second, interpretation clearly labeled. "Sutton is willing to testify. He wants immunity." "That's my decision to make," Brand said. "I know," Maggie said. "I'm telling you what he's asking for, so you can decide whether the testimony is worth it." Brand looked at Luke. Luke spread his hands slightly, a gesture that said plainly that this was Maggie's meeting, and he was here as a witness, not a participant. Brand looked back at Maggie with an expression that was professional appreciation, doing its best to stay professional. "Where is Sutton now?" he said. "He didn't say in this letter. He said he would come to me when he was ready, which means he's frightened and watching to see whether we move in the right direction before he commits." Maggie folded her hands on the table. "If you make a visible move toward Vane before Sutton comes forward, he'll run. He'll decide we don't need him, and he can't afford the risk." "So we wait," Brand said. "We wait," Maggie confirmed. "But we prepare. If I can get the circuit court calendar records from the district office through a legitimate records request, one that doesn't flag Vane specifically, just a routine audit request, I can cross-reference the filing dates on every fraudulent deed against the calendar windows and build the correlation without Sutton's testimony. When he does come forward, we have 2 independent threads pointing to the same man." Brand was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone recalculating a case he had believed was resolved and finding it was larger than he'd measured. "You understand," he said, "that Arthur Vane has been district clerk for 11 years. He has connections at the state level that Danner and Pike don't have. This becomes considerably more complicated if we move against him." "I understand," Maggie said. "I also understand that if we don't move against him, the system that enabled this fraud still has a hole in it, and whoever fills Vane's role next will have the same access and the same opportunity. She met Brand's eyes. The families who lost their land deserve a system that actually works, not one that's been cleaned up on the outside. Brand made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. He stood up. "Write the audit request. I'll sign it as a state-level inquiry. That way it goes around Vane's office rather than through it." He picked up his hat. "I want the cross-reference on my desk by Friday." He left. Luke stayed. "Friday," he said, looking at the stack of work already on her table. "That's 4 days." 3.5, she said. "What do you need?" She gave him 2 tasks. Both of them things that required being on horseback and being willing to ride to 2 different properties east of town to verify specific dates from the freight records against the movements of Danner's deputies in the months before the seizures. It was corroboration work, the kind of detailed verification that filled in the chain between known facts, and it required someone who could read a trail and read a man's face when he was being honest and ride hard in a day to cover the ground needed. He left within the hour. He came back at dusk with everything she'd asked for and 2 additional pieces of information she hadn't known to ask for, which he explained without being asked. To explain why he thought they were relevant, and they were relevant, both of them. Filling gaps, she had been trying to think around. She added them to the notes. They worked like this for 3 days separately, then together at her table in the evenings, building the calendar correlation. The way you build a fence, 1 post at a time, checking each one for levelness before moving to the next. She did not think of it as romantic, this working. She thought of it as evidence that they were in fact suited to each other, that their minds moved in compatible rhythms, that they could occupy the same space for hours without one of them needing the other to perform something or explain themselves or justify how they were thinking. Nathan had been good to work alongside. Luke was different, not better, not worse, but different in the specific way of a person who had never tried to make her smaller in order to feel adequately large himself. She noticed this. She stored it. On the 4th morning, Gerald Sutton walked through the door of her office. He was younger than she'd expected from his handwriting, perhaps 35, with the worn clothing and careful eyes of someone who had spent years being useful to men more powerful than himself, and had recently decided that usefulness had a limit. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the table, at Maggie, at the stack of papers that clearly represented more documentation than he had expected her to have. "You built it without me," he said. There was something in his voice she hadn't anticipated, not resentment, but a kind of relief, as if the distance between what he knew and what could be proven had collapsed to a point where his choice became simpler. "I built most of it," Maggie said. "There are 2 connections I still need a witness for. Sit down, Mr. Sutton." He sat down. She told him what she had and what she needed. She did not tell him what he would get in exchange, that was Brand's to offer, but she told him clearly that his testimony was not the foundation of the case, that the foundation had already been built, and that what he could provide was the last piece that turned a strong case into an unbreakable one. She watched him decide. It took about 4 minutes. She had seen Nathan do this, sit quietly while a witness calculated their options, and she had the same capacity for stillness now. "Vane told Pike about the November window," Sutton said. "I was in the room. I carried the message to the Meridian Depot myself. I have a receipt with Vane's name on it that he doesn't know I kept." "Where is the receipt?" Maggie said. He reached into his vest and put it on the table. She looked at it. She picked it up. She read it carefully and set it down and said, "I need to send for Marshal Brand." "I know," Sutton said. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had just set it down. "I should have come forward months ago." "Yes," she said with no softness and no cruelty. "You should have." She stood to send for Brand. "But you're here now. That counts for something." Brand took Sutton's testimony that afternoon formally with a court recorder present, and the receipt went into evidence alongside the calendar correlation Maggie had built. By Thursday evening, Brand had enough to file a formal complaint against Arthur Vane with the state attorney's office. Vane was placed on administrative suspension pending investigation the following morning. The news reached Cottonwood Crossing by noon. Maggie heard it in her office from the county recorder's aide, who came to tell her with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had just watched a wall they'd believed was permanent fall down. She thanked him. She sat alone for a moment after he left. This was it. This was actually it. Not the almost it of Danner's arrest. Not the good enough of the hearing, but the genuine closing of the circle. Every piece of the mechanism that had stolen 8 families' land and killed her husband had been identified, documented, and placed before the appropriate authority. The rest was process court proceedings, formal restorations, the slow machinery of institutional accountability grinding through its necessary work. She had built it. Piece by piece, month by month, beginning in the quiet terror of her first widowed winter, when she'd found the first irregularity in a property transfer record and decided with no clear sense of where it would lead that she was not going to look away. She allowed herself 2 minutes of sitting still with that. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The property restoration orders came through the following Tuesday, signed by the circuit court judge, who had ridden in specifically for the purpose, the same man Reverend Caldwell told her quietly after the service, whom Nathan had met with privately in his last months, and who had been emerged one of the few people Nathan had trusted enough to warn. The judge signed each order in open court, and Maggie was present for all of them, and she watched each family's name called, each deed corrected, each property formally returned, and she felt something she had no precise word for. Not triumph, which was too loud, and not closure, which was too clean, but something in the territory between them. Something that felt like justice, taking the shape it was supposed to take. Ada Reeves came to her office afterward. She stood in the doorway and looked at Maggie for a moment, and then she said, "James would have wanted to thank you." Maggie shook her head. "Nathan started it. I finished it. That's the whole story." "That's not the whole story," Ada said firmly. "Nathan was a good man who made a mistake and tried to fix it. You were the one who wouldn't let it stay buried after he was gone. That matters differently." She stepped forward and put her hand briefly on Maggie's. "It matters to me. I want you to know that." Maggie did not cry. She waited until Ada had gone, and then she sat very still for 3 minutes and breathed carefully, and that was as close as she allowed herself. Luke came that evening with the formal papers showing Silver Creek Ranch's land boundaries, as confirmed by the state survey, cleared of any disputed claims, the last lingering paperwork from 3 years of boundary disagreement, finally, permanently resolved. He put them on her desk. She looked at them. "Nathan would have done that himself," she said, "if he'd lived." "I know," Luke said. "This is me finishing what he should have." She looked up at him. "Spring," she said. "It's October," he said. "Close enough," she said. He laughed. She had been making him laugh more often lately, which she found she cared about in the specific way you care about something you hadn't realized you'd been missing. "Maggie," he said. He was serious now, the particular seriousness she had learned to recognize, not heavy, but weighted, like a man who has thought carefully about what he is going to say and intends to say it precisely. "I know what I asked you, and I know what you answered, and I'm not changing the terms. But I want you to understand something." "Tell me," she said. "I spent 3 years being a man who made decisions about people before I gave them the chance to show me who they were. You, Nathan. The small ranchers I could have helped but didn't because it wasn't my problem." He held her gaze. "Watching you work, watching you build what you built, not with power or money, but with attention and patience, and knowing what you knew that changed something in me that needed changing." He put his hat on her desk beside the survey papers. "Whatever happens between us, I want you to know that. You made me better at being a person. That's separate from everything else." She looked at him for a long moment. "You made me remember," she said finally, "that I was allowed to still be one." He held out his hand. She took it, and they walked out of the office together into the October evening, and the town was doing what towns do, being ordinary, being alive, moving around its grief and its recent upheaval with the particular resilience of communities that have survived difficult things before and will survive them again. They married on a Saturday in early October, 6 weeks after the restoration orders in the yard of Silver Creek Ranch, under a sky that was enormous and clear, and specifically Texas, in a way that felt to Maggie like the landscape was participating. She wore a cream dress made to fit her exactly as she was, not as she might be, not adjusted to minimize or compress, but made for the body she lived in, and had always lived in, and she wore it as what it was, a dress she had chosen, on a day she had chosen, with a man she had chosen on her own terms and no one else's. The families who had gotten their land back were there. Clara Finch, Ada Reeves, the Morrison nephew, the Hendersons. Thomas Greer, the young deputy whose testimony had broken the case open, stood near the back and looked like a man still learning how to be easy in a room full of people who knew what he'd come from. And Maggie caught his eye once and nodded, and he nodded back, and that was enough. Benjamin Crowell, Lucas Foreman, stood beside Luke with the dignified discomfort of a man who considers himself too old for ceremonies and too loyal to miss one. He had told Maggie 2 weeks prior in the blunt and genuine way that was apparently his only mode of communication. "You're the first person I've ever seen make him stop and listen before he moved. Do you understand how rare that is?" She had told him she was beginning to. Reverend Caldwell performed the ceremony. He kept it short, which was the right choice, because the day did not need a great deal of words. The words that mattered had been said in holding pens and county hearing rooms and vestries and kitchen tables across the past 3 months, and what was left was the simple public acknowledgement of what was already true. When it was done, and the small crowd had moved toward the tables of food that Luke's ranch hands had laid out. Good food, practical food, nothing elaborate. Maggie found herself standing briefly alone at the edge of the yard, and she allowed herself a moment with Nathan, not a conversation. She was not a woman who talked to the dead, or hadn't been, or was still deciding whether she was. But a moment of acknowledgement of the 8 years that had shaped her, of the man who had taught her what she knew, of the grief that had not vanished because she had done other things with her hands and her mind and her heart, but had simply become one of the things she carried, rather than the thing that carried her. She thought, "I loved you. I resented you. I finished what you started. I don't owe you perfection in how I remember you, or paralysis in how I move forward." She thought, "Thank you for the ledger, for the coded entries, for Reverend Caldwell, for the things you left that let me find my way through." She thought, "Rest." And then Luke was beside her, not asking what she was thinking, just present, and she turned back toward the gathering and walked with him into the rest of the day. In the weeks that followed, the ordinary shape of their life established itself, and it was not the shape either of them might have predicted, but it was precisely the shape that fit them. Luke managed Silver Creek and began giving his hands written wage agreements and opened the holding pens to small ranchers at fair rates, because he had spent 3 months watching what happened when powerful men controlled the infrastructure that everyone else depended on, and he had decided to be a different kind of powerful. Maggie ran her office, which was busier than anyone had expected, because the ranching families in the county had learned that there was a person in the courthouse who would read a contract clearly and tell you what it actually said, and they came steadily in a stream that showed no sign of stopping. She hired a part-time aide, a woman of 51 named Ruth, recently widowed herself, who had a quick mind and reliable handwriting and no patience for bureaucratic runaround, which made her ideally suited to the work. Maggie trained her. Nathan had trained her by working alongside, explaining the logic, making sure Ruth understood not just the procedure, but the reason the procedure existed, so that when the procedure failed, Ruth would know which principle to reach for instead. Some afternoons, when the paperwork allowed, Luke came by the office with something: coffee, a deed question, once an entire basket of food from the ranch kitchen, because his cook had made too much and the excess needed to go somewhere. He did not hover. He did not manage. He came when he had a reason and left when the reason was done, and in between he ran his ranch and let her run her work, and they met in the evenings at one house or the other, and were, without making a large event of it, glad to see each other. It was, Maggie thought, what Nathan had tried to build with her and had not quite managed, not because he hadn't loved her, but because loving someone and knowing how to build a life alongside them as an equal are separate skills, and you have to learn them separately. She had learned her half. Luke was learning his. They were learning the rest together. In November, the state attorney's office announced that Arthur Vane had agreed to a full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence, and that his confession had implicated 2 additional county-level officials in adjacent counties who had been running smaller variations of the same scheme. Brand sent her a letter from Austin that was professional and precise, and contained in its final paragraph the observation that the Cottonwood Crossing investigation had produced a model of evidence construction that his office was considering formalizing as a training document. She read that paragraph twice. She set the letter down. She picked it up and read it once more. Then she went to tell Luke, not because she needed his approval, but because he was the person she wanted to tell. The converted record room, the old sheriff's office where Nathan had worked for 8 years, where she had kissed Luke in a summer storm, while the world outside was trying to burn down, had been officially reclassified as the County Public Records Room in October. The plaque on the door said so. Inside it were the original deed records, the restored survey maps, the corrected brand registry, and a new index that Maggie had built from scratch in the first weeks of her appointment, organized by parcel number and owner name and date, so that anyone who came in could find what they were looking for without needing to know the system in advance. She went there one afternoon in late November, checking the filing of a recently restored deed, and Luke came in behind her, not following her. He had his own errand there, a ranch contract that needed the official land description verified. She looked up from the files. "I warned you," she said. "Don't fall for me." He set the contract on her desk. "You did. And you kissed me anyway." "Only after you chose me," he said. She took his hand across the desk. Not the gesture of a woman grateful to have been chosen, not the softness of someone surprised to have ended up somewhere good. The gesture of a person who knows exactly what she has built, exactly who she is, and exactly what she is choosing and why. Maggie Rowan had buried a husband and uncovered his mistakes and honored the best of him anyway. She had built a case from coded ledgers and freight receipts and the testimony of frightened people who needed someone steady enough to catch what they threw her way. She had stood in a county hearing room and told a room full of people a truth that was painful and complicated and refused to be made simple, and she had told it clearly, and it had been enough. She was not Sheriff Rowan's widow. She had not been for some time. She was the woman who finished what her husband started, who built her own office and her own income, and her own reputation on skills she had always had and was finally allowed to use. She was the woman who had chosen a worthy man with clear eyes and no illusions, and who would continue choosing him every day as a decision rather than a rescue. She was Maggie Rowan, and she was exactly where she had made herself, and that was the only ending this story was ever going to have.